Well, hello and welcome to this very important and very timely, actually, discussion on the state of wildfire risk and what can be done about it around the world, the different solutions that people are trying. We have with this a great panel here, I'm pleased to say. It's going to be a 45-minute conversation. We'll keep to time. And this is the second in our BRINK events, which are live discussions on some of the latest and most salient business issues brought to you with a number of experts in the field. So I hope that you find these interesting, and the best way to find out what other events we've got coming up is to subscribe to our newsletter at brinknews.com/newsletter. So on with the show. So let me just introduce everyone. First of all, we have Sydney Hedberg, who is a senior business development specialist for Marsh McLennan, focused on driving innovative solutions for catastrophic natural catastrophe risks. So Sydney works with both the private and public sectors and a number of other partners at Marsh McLennan as well. Also, Andy Reid, who's Vice President of Public Sector Practice at Carpenter, and is part of the global team focused on the unique risk management needs of government agencies and entities. Then finally, we have Sydney Chamberlin, who is a climate policy associate at the Nature Conservancy, who works to advance policy that can help, particularly in California, achieve its climate goals. And the purpose and the salience of her will become very apparent when we talk about some of the research she's been doing. So welcome to everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. We've got two Sydneys on the call, so we're going to have to make sure we distinguish between them. Andy, you and I are not going to have any problem. So let's just dive straight into it, because we've got a lot to get through. And you know, it's kind of incredible that as we speak, there's a huge number of fires raging around the world. We've got one in Lake Tahoe, the Caldor fire, which has seen thousands of people evacuated. I think it's only something like 9 or 10% contained at the moment. There's another in the popular wilderness area of Minnesota called the Greenwood fire that's going on at the moment. We have one in the south of France, which has hit a number of vineyards down there. And then we've still got the Dixie fire, which I think was California's biggest ever fire, right? It's still bubbling or burning away in California. And then, you know, we've got one in Paraguay where the smoke has filled the capital, Ascension. We've got one burning in Russia, several fires in Greece, in Algeria. I mean, the list just goes on, right? So is this just climate change, ladies and gentlemen? I mean, is something else going on? You know, maybe we could just talk for a moment about what is lying behind these enormous spate of fires. Anyone want to join in? Sydney H.
We'll go,
Sydney
yeah,
Hedberg.
Sydney H. We'll specify the last names. Well, thank you, Tom. And I think you set the stage very well, as this is not, you know, a country specific issue. It's totally global. And wildfires are getting more intense as the climate warms. And, you know, there's very little to say that it's not warming. You can kind of track the patterns and see what's going on. But, you know, wildfires are also getting more intense as there is more added fuel to their fire in the form of woody biomass or the dead organic material on the forest floors. And, you know, a big part of this is when forests are not cleared or controlled burns are either not prioritized and or budgeted for, the buildup of this dead organic matter on forest floors can really overwhelm the forest and provide a ripe scenario to produce a very intense fire. And Sydney C is obviously going to speak to this, you know, in much more deep fashion, as this is where she, you know, sits. But, you know, the more dry trees and brush become, the more flammable, leading to quicker spreads. And of course, this is happening because it is getting warmer. When trees are healthy, they're about 50% water. When they lose this water content because they have become infested with bugs or simply have reached the end of their life, they become a major risk. In California alone, there are over 150 million standing dead trees in these forests, meaning that they do not have that water content. And with this dryness, they also burn much hotter, which makes it more challenging to put out. The problem is also becoming exacerbated with home and commercial building spreading into risky areas known as the wildland urban interface, or the WUI. So proper focus and funding on forest management, just like they do at the Nature Conservancy, is key on both public and private lands. And a lot of times this could involve a public-private partnership, which is what we work on quite a bit at Marsh McLennan. A reassessment of resilience and mitigation is also so critical. Pre-event planning rather than post-loss in the form of, less CO2 controlled burns during less dry times of the year, assessment of utility poles in surrounding areas to assure there are no defects, which could result in a collapse or spark. The climate is going to evolve, but we can't, we can kind of help possibly.
Right. Okay. I mean, we're obviously going to get in detail into some of those solutions, but let's stick for a moment on what's causing all this. So Sydney just mentioned a number of factors that are leading into this, growth of urbanization, increasing amounts of dry timber lying around, climate change. Can you just give a sense for people who are not at wildfire experts to give a sense of priorities? I mean, which of these is the most or the biggest cause of these fires?
Well, Tom, thank you. And I'm glad to have Sydney's comments to build on. And, I think the points she raised are so important. So in California, I think what's important to realize here is that fire is actually not a new phenomenon. And speaking specifically to California, fire is something that has always been part of our landscapes. Prior to European colonization, something like 4.5 million acres a year would burn regularly. And that might either be started by lightning or even intentionally by native tribes who used fire to cultivate the land. So a lot of our ecosystems evolved in ways that adapted to fire. And in California, our forested ecosystems evolved with frequent low to moderate severity fires. And what happened is those low to moderate severity fires would clear out some of the fuels, reduce the likelihood of large, severe wildfires by removing fuels. But, when we think about which factors sort of made the biggest change, it's a number of things. A lot has changed in the past couple hundred years. Obviously, the native practices of controlled burns have just stopped when native people are pushed off the land. And then we have this legacy in the 20th century of aggressive fire suppression and other forest management tactics combined with land use decisions. And then you toss in some climate change. All of that's contributed to basically new burning patterns. And those burning patterns, some ecosystems respond differently to those. And so what we're seeing now are these changes that come as a result of that. And then we have where people is living has changed. And in the United States, what we're seeing is rapid growth in the WUI, this wildland urban interface. And in fact, I think since 1990, more than half of new homes in California were built in this wildland urban interface area. So all these things together are acting as factors. And I think what's important to note, though, is that fire is inevitably a part of our future, whether you're in California or somewhere else. And so really what we have to think about is how to plan for that future, learning how to coexist with fire.
Right. Okay. Well, we can get on to some of that. I mean, I was very struck by one fact I read recently, which is that I think 2.7 million people live in an area in California in severe risk of fire. I mean, that seems an extraordinary number. Andy, I don't want to leave you out of this part of the conversation.
On this? And appreciate it, Tom. Yeah, I think, to me, when I look at the global landscape, it's just a stunning example as to how climate change can affect how these natural disasters are occurring in a way that outpaces adaptation. And so we're seeing these larger, more intense fires throughout Europe, throughout Australia, throughout the US, all these other places you mentioned. And it creates a really massive logistical challenge and capability challenge to respond and recover to that. And so this is, threatening areas that are currently developed, but also perhaps changing how we need to think about areas we do develop. And, both the Sydney's touched on this around how we make decisions about where to build, right? That's something that's going to be really important to think about the risk and understand the risk. And so the impacts right now are really severe. I mean, the pictures are striking when you look at, livestock being trapped and all the other crazy logistical things that people go through to escape and evacuate. And it's tough to look at, but there are a lot of areas that are uninsured, and marrying this a little bit to the insurance markets and how it affects them. There are a lot of areas that are uninsured right now and likely need insurance solutions in the face of this challenge. And then there are other areas where they're at threat of losing their insurance market because of the volatility that's happening here. And certainly financial resilience is an important factor that we'll get into in more detail here. But I think what really needs to be brought to bear right now more broadly in the urgency is around helping public sector understand the changing risk, invest in ways to improve the physical resilience, and then pursue partnerships to drive financial resilience and maintain their insurance market.
Okay, well,
that to me is really the urgency now.
Yeah. There's a lot there. So let's start unpacking some of that. And I think what all of you are saying very clearly is just the huge risk, primarily to populations and livelihoods, first of all, but also to businesses, right? I mean, this is a hugely large business disruptor, potentially, for a number of businesses, many businesses around the world that might be impacted by this. So let's turn first of all to physical resilience, and then we can look at some of the financial and insurance aspects of this. But Sydney C, you've done a lot of work recently in California with the Paradise community, which was completely flattened, as many people will remember, in the Campfire fire of 2018. Just to remind people of that. And it's interesting, actually, I don't know if you saw that a book came out today by a journalist, Lizzie Johnson, on Paradise, talking about the lives that were disrupted. But that campfire killed 85 people, $16 billion of property loss, 11,000 people homeless. I mean, the numbers are just staggering, aren't they? And many people around the world will remember this small community of Paradise that was flattened. Now, you at the Nature Conservancy went back there and have been working since then with the community on how to build greater physical resilience in the community so that they might rebuild their town. Could you just talk to us about that? I mean, first of all, I guess, how did you approach this? And then, what were some of the solutions that you came up with?
Yeah, happy to, Tom. So, this fire came through and it was just devastating. Having had a chance to drive up there after the fire, I myself was shocked at just how completely flattened this town was. And so the town's now at a stage where it's starting to think about rebuilding, and they're thinking about their future, and they're thinking, how do we build in a resilient way? How do we build in a way that helps to protect communities in a future that might be characterized by fire? And so to explore that, the Nature Conservancy collaborated with the Paradise Recreation and Parks District and something called the Conservation Biology Institute to explore how we might implement fire-resilient community design. And so we asked the question, how much would fire risk in Paradise change over time? And specifically, how much would urban ignition risk from wildfire change if key parcels of land around the town's perimeter were used as a community encircling buffer zone? And so the idea is that this buffer zone, land would be used as green spaces, things like parks that are managed for fire risk instead of sites for new housing. So we investigated that. And what we found is that by not building back on parcels of lands in the highest risk areas for wildfire, there's strong potential to reduce future losses and improve community resilience to wildfire. So in other words, this is about land use planning. And the idea is that land use planning can play a really important role in how we increase fire resilience and reducing risk. If we put fire safety at the forefront of the decisions around where we're siting or not siting development. So the idea with this sort of community encircling buffer is that, first of all, for it to be effective, it has to be combined with development policy in a way that limits sprawl or urban growth. So you're basically setting up an urban growth boundary. And when you do that, you've got a whole bunch of benefits that come with it. Outside of fire risk, one of these community encircling buffers that serves as an urban growth boundary can limit air and water pollution. It reduces communities' emissions of greenhouse gases that would both be associated with disturbing land for development, but also with transportation and driving. It reduces the need to expand utilities into the area, and it helps to prevent the fragmentation of ecosystems, which impacts wildlife and biodiversity. And when we limit sprawl through one of these buffers, We also make it easier to undertake ecological forest restoration work, things like prescribed burns and the thinning of fuels, which collectively actually reduce the risk further of severe wildfire. So that's great. And then in addition to that, so, you basically have this buffer. It's providing you all these benefits. It's also effectively serving as a fuel break for the community, and it's reducing urban ignition risk in the city. But the buffer can also do other things. It can give a community recreational space, helps to contribute to the community's economy. It can help serve as a staging area for firefighters or for people who have to evacuate a fire. So, those are the questions of Paradise. And, obviously Paradise is unique, but it can serve as a model for other towns, and not just towns that have suffered massive fire losses, but towns that are in the stages of thinking about, where do we develop? Where do we build? How do we expand? And some of the important lessons that we carried out of this work, first of all, it's easier to prevent growth into high fire risk areas than it is to take it out later once it's established. And secondly, with this, concept of a buffer, they're not one size fits all. The whole point here is that every community is unique, and this kind of buffering strategy can be designed with the unique needs of a community in mind. So the whole bring in strategic planning, use spatial data to assess the effectiveness of these strategies. And finally, people are beginning to explore, both including the Nature Conservancy, Marsh McLennan, thinking about how more rigorous fire behavior modeling can be paired with this concept to quantitatively characterize the losses a community would have with or without a buffer. So a lot of exciting results that came out of that work.
So that's really interesting. So we've got this community quite self-contained in the case of Paradise, and what you've recommended essentially is to build this buffer around it. One question that arises in my mind is, what's to stop people building their houses beyond the buffer? I mean, would that be a problem?
Yeah, I mean that, and that's sort of the key question, I think, right? The whole point of the buffer is that it has this incredible ability to help us, reduce the ignition risk, reduce losses inside. But as soon as people start to leapfrog across it, it loses those benefits. And so this really becomes a policy question. It really becomes a question of, first of all, thinking about how we design our communities, how we plan for land use. But I think, another sort of vein in this conversation is thinking about communities acting as a collective whole. And that's another important part of this work, that not only could a buffer help protect a community, but it also enables sort of community scale collective action. And I don't know, I think, so the answer to your question is complicated. How do you keep people from doing it? But I think it has a policy and through communities collectively taking action.
Right. Yeah. Kind of empowering these communities to take action themselves. And another question I have is whether just at a kind of primary level, we should be encouraging people to live in these areas where there's such a high fire risk. I mean, is that a sensible thing to be doing?
That's right. I mean, and of course, my own personal instinct is to say, oh no, it's very scary. It's a challenge not only for people and not only fire, but also for nature. And one of the most important things we think about the Nature Conservancy is this fact that when we protect nature, nature can help to protect us. So in general, there are a lot of challenges with this notion of, should communities live in this wildland urban interface or not? And generally speaking, it sometimes has been sort of a politically tenable item to discuss. But I think as people are seeing more and more the impacts of these fires and understanding that fires are an inevitable part of our future, it is starting to be a question that's more palatable for discussion.
Sydney, Tom, I want to bring you and Andy in. I mean, you also participated in this work with Nature Conservancy, and Sydney C referenced this idea of expanding it beyond the physical resilience. We'll get into lots of other kind of insurance issues, but just on this question of Paradise, what were the takeaways for you from this work, Sydney or Andy?
Tom, yeah, I would just say to start, with regards to your last question, Paradise is facing the challenge of, do we continue with the exposure that we have and we know about now after that loss experience? And what we're finding in collaboration with the Nature Conservancy and other partners here is that there are ways for communities to remain and continue when they have exposure, but they need to understand that and manage that in a fundamentally different way than a lot are thinking about it currently right now. And so there are methods that work. And the exciting thing about our contribution and work with the Nature Conservancy in Paradise here is what we did is we took their study as to the risk reduction to risk to ignition, and we put it into catastrophe models and took a look at that. And the findings are pretty striking that if you do adopt and enforce modern structural codes while investing in wildfire buffer area strategies, it can greatly reduce wildfire risk and make a material impact on insurance availability and pricing in communities that are facing wildfire risk. This is a real, it's a real roadmap to a solution for communities that are facing this risk. And there are ways that they can make these tough land use decisions and public policy decisions, ideally ahead of disaster, and start to work towards reducing their risk. But in Paradise's case, obviously they're doing it after the fact, and they really recognize that they need to change the risk in order to persist. So,
one of the key data points that struck me in the work was that you reduced value at risk by 42%. Right?
Yes.
Can you just unpack the significance of that? Is a pretty large number, and what do you mean by value at risk?
Yeah. So what we found is when we ran the data through the CAT models, combined buffer area strategy. Well, I should say not every buffer area strategy provides the same risk reduction value. And so what we did find importantly is that it's very important to model and understand that. And make good decisions around that. So some of the buffer area strategy scenarios that we modeled were much more impactful than the others. And there's one particular model where they were planning to acquire a large swath of land on the eastern side of the community that, coupled with modern structural code adoption, could reduce the average annual loss by 42%. And that's a very significant number. In terms of real reduction to risk to ignition is calculated by the models, but also importantly, that would be reflected as insurers are looking at the risk in some form. So it would impact potentially, if you're reducing the large loss by, let's say, 40%, that means there's less capital required by an insurance carrier who's thinking about working in the market there in Paradise. And so it does have an impact on their decision and rating. And I think a strong one in terms of encouraging them that the community is invested in reducing the risk and trying to ensure that there will be stable and sustainable pricing going forward.
And when you say building requirements, does it require, in the modeling, did it require people to change the materials used for building to be more fire resilient, or was it simply just building to code, the existing code?
We looked at both, but assuming that they adopted more stringent modern structural codes provided the most value. So using the best available code requirements that are out there. So we did look at that, yes. And they've talked about that at the community level and are thinking about those decisions as well as these broader public policy decisions about where to acquire parcels or to think about where to invest in managed land.
Well, let's look at you touched on some of the insurance solutions. Let's look at that now, Sydney. I mean, so how do we, so we've got this modeling, we've got this great work by TNC that could, as Sydney C says, be used in other contexts, other communities. How does all that data and research translate into finding kind of viable insurance for these areas? And maybe just even before that, you could just set the scene a bit about, I think, what Andy was saying right at the beginning around how insurers are struggling to provide coverage for a lot of this. Isn't that the case?
Absolutely. And what happened, I'm trying to think if it was last year, they all seem to be running together at this point, that the insurance commissioner in California actually had to step in, Commissioner Lara, and say, you can't non-renew just because people are in high risk areas, because carriers are trying to drop, just because, again, they have a surplus to manage, and if they're publicly traded and everything. But from a traditional indemnity standpoint, there must be another solution for these most at risk, right? And unaffordable, or in some cases uninsurable clientele just cannot be an option. Asking individuals to simply have no protection for what usually will be their largest asset, whether it is their home or their business, like you said, it gets very disrupted, would not be responsible. And it's a really large burden to ask individuals to carry. And we understand it's also a big burden to ask carriers to write. And with the modeling and everything, we're looking at historical patterns of let's try and predict this a little bit more. But when you're getting more of these 1 in 500 year loss events, it does really end up hurting, carriers' books of business, but also we have to figure out reasons or help to the public. So another point is alternative solutions, right? So we've had to come up with some different solutions, and Andy's really been working quite a bit on this. Parametrics are a great example. So parametrics are different from traditional coverage, where they pay out if a certain threshold of destruction is triggered. X amount of land is burned. That's really how this product is. It kind of can act like a derivative at times. And this coverage is reserved for those most catastrophic events. And a big part of this is it does not replace indemnity, the indemnity component that has been traditional insurance. It basically complements that. So, if we're unable to leverage solutions, the losses again will fall to the government, to the public sector. And as we've seen with our nation's debt and other nations' debt, maybe just California's in general, now I got a little bit more, but it just simply is not sustainable. So insurance solutions definitely need to be coupled with mitigation solutions, just like Sydney and Andy touched upon, and they'll involve industry and government alike. There need to be incentives for resiliency. I think a good parallel to that would be when there are incentives for solar power, right? When the world is trying to transition to green energy, it was formerly not as much anymore, but it was costing more, hence the need to add a monetary incentive. At times, things cannot simply be done for the greater good if it ends up costing businesses and individuals excessively more money. That's a big burden again to put on. So again, as we look at, there was an article in the Times about a vineyard up in Napa, and they were adding in fire hoses and pumps and making sure that they were really, they could be taken care of in the situation. So in order to incentivize business and homeowners to do this, there needs to be a financial benefit. They need to be able to get, better insurance coverage when they can say, check those boxes. So as Sydney mentioned, it's going to fall as a policy change, as well as carriers, being willing to add this component into their underwriting. And what couples with it is the catastrophic mapping that we're able to do, and basically be able to, you're never going to be able to predict this 100%, but having a better lay of the land.
Right. And one of you mentioned this concept of community-based catastrophe insurance, right? Can you just, maybe that's what you were getting at, but could you, Andy, maybe you could just unpack that a bit? What is that a new form of insurance that hasn't been seen in the market before?
So there have been some examples of partnerships aligned with the concept of community-based catastrophe insurance, but we worked in partnership with the Wharton Risk Center and developed a concept paper around this, essentially outlining a roadmap by which risk carriers can partner with community level leadership or state level leadership to essentially create programs that help to support, enhance, and sustain their insurance markets. And what we've found through that process and looking at that is that there's great potential to help communities better understand their risk and make better public policy decisions. But there's also great ways to build in incentives around physical risk reduction. As Sydney was talking about a little bit, when you make those large scale, community scale investments, and you're actually at the table engaging in the process of supporting or acquiring insurance or risk capacity, you're getting good modeling information. You're understanding how those investments will change the risk fundamentally, how that might be viewed in the insurance market, and you're working with insurance carriers or reinsurers or other capacity to essentially bring solutions to bear. And so there are kind of 4 different models that we outline as to how communities can work together. Some of them on the lighter touch side, where you're just facilitating an engagement with an insurance carrier in the community, and some more robust where you're going as far as creating a risk-bearing entity or a captive. But we believe that a solution like this in Paradise to accompany these investments in risk reduction would make a significant impact on the viability of the insurance market there going forward. The other really important part here is that when you're at the community or state level or even national level, looking at your insurance market, understanding who's uninsured, what those demographics look like, and working with risk capacity carriers or thinking about parametric solutions, you can actually create targeted assistance programs that will deliver funding quickly to those in need, perhaps going above and beyond some of FEMA's assistance or reserving some flexible pools of capital unlocked by these parametric triggers to help make those decisions to relocate or change or elevate homes, right, or harden homes. And so there's a lot of benefits.
Because it's not a one size fits all, obviously, right?
No, yeah, this is it's a partnership where risk expertise needs to partner with communities and states to help them understand exactly what the risk is first, and then come up with the right solutions to match. And in many cases, it'll make sense to preserve risk-based pricing so that people understand, to the extent possible, people understand that risk signal, but deliver targeted assistance. And so we're actively working, Guy Carpenter is actively working, and Marsh McLennan is actively working with a number of cities and communities looking at this challenge and how to implement both maybe assistance programs for people they know who are low income and at risk, and bring equity to recovery, if you will, but also looking at ways to offer targeted insurance products to maybe access new areas of the market that have traditionally gone uninsured, either due to individual consumer decisions or a lack of market product being available.
Let's talk a little about the public sector's role, right? I mean, so you outlined very well, both of you, the kind of ways in which the private markets, private financing could be flexible and adaptive. What's the public's kind of what's the public role in this? I mean, should it be just to provide a backstop in all cases, or is that in actually creating a risk of perverse incentives?
So there's perverse incentives. Yeah, that's an interesting thread to go on. But the public sector role, whether they like it or not, in many cases where people are uninsured and disasters are happening, they are thrust in as the backstop, relying potentially on forms of post-disaster financing, so potentially raising taxes on their tax base or relying on federal or sovereign level relief after the fact, which in many cases is appropriated and impacts national level budgets. And so what we see is a tremendous reliance where people are uninsured on that post-disaster relief. And as a part of that, there's a tremendous amount of disaster suffering that occurs. And actually, there's been a lot of talk in the last few years about the inequities of relying on that process, particularly in the US. What you find is that low-income communities and low-income individuals don't navigate the recovery process as well as wealthier communities, wealthier states, and individuals. Right. So the potential there is for public sector leaders to think about new solutions with private sector to bring capital in that can provide assistance in a targeted way to really augment the recovery for those low-income individuals or marginalized communities. And so there's great potential there for the public sector to say, even local level public sector leaders can say, we want to change the system. We want to make it better for the people in our community who need it the most. And then that will help everyone take a step back and try to think about these broader public policy challenges and understand their risks. So right. I think there's kind of a quarterbacking role in some of this for public sector, but industry really needs to lean in and help them understand what tools are available.
Sydney C, I want to bring you back into for the conversation around on this? I mean, what were your takeaways from your research at TNC? You've talked about the community response, but is there a wider public sector role, do you think, that needs to be played in these situations?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, first of all, as we think about land use planning, this is something that happens a lot on the local scale and then local governments. And this is somewhere where the state can come in to help create a regional or local planning framework that communities can use as they take on the kind of analysis that Andy was talking about. And that's going to require extra funding. I think we also need extra funding to support management of our lands, thinking about, for example, these buffer areas. How are we going to manage those? They're only effective if you manage them well. And that could come from local initiatives. We could have state or federal disaster mitigation grants to use to fund it, but we've got to think about how to do that. I think it's important too, as we think about all of these changes, all this land use planning that takes place on local scales, climate change, disaster resilience actions really have to reflect local conditions. They may not even lie along jurisdictional boundaries. For example, if we think about an area where you have the highest risk, it may not lie within a city's boundaries. And so as we think about how municipal and county governments or local governments can implement these measures, we've got to provide support. And we may need to think about even new policy directions to implement this. So for example, in California, we have local jurisdictions that have started to think about using a new kind of special district to launch climate resilience projects. And we might think about how we do that, how we can provide focused service as we develop resilient communities and provide the kind of support from the state that these communities need to plan land use well.
That would seem to be a really important role for someone to play, right, Sydney H? I mean, to be the kind of convener of those new ad hoc groups that, both from the private sector, from state level, to come together to provide some of these solutions.
Right. And, that's the whole point with the public-private partnerships. I mean, without funding for any of these things, just like Sydney C and Andy were saying, and without emphasis on it, we can't just keep operating as, well, the wildfires are going to keep happening, and then we have to just keep rebuilding, because, that just is not a proactive way to be combating this. And, wildfires are one natural catastrophe that can, in fact, be prevented. Hurricanes, earthquakes, they truly are these acts of God, which we talk about. But many wildfires are man-made, which we clearly have no way of stopping. But like Sydney C said, if we're managing these buffer zones a little bit better, spreading out the trees, making sure that we're doing clearance, even with man-made fires, they will be put out more easily, right? Because they will hit these zones where they will just dissipate instead of having so much fuel in order to keep going. So I think there are a couple ways that this can help. One would obviously be continued investment in our first responders, right? Firefighters, the equipment they use, and then that also goes into making sure that there are affordable and available insurance coverage for people coming in to like trim trees, right? We just had a huge fire here in Utah, where Andy and I both live and where Sydney C is from originally. And the deployment was exceptional in terms of response, right? And then again, bringing in the public sector, FEMA authorized funds to fight the fire. And then, so again, it really was that public-private coming together and really showcasing how, they pull on these direct, and you kind of have to have a plan in place or it'll just spiral out of control. But there are numerous components, and I think there are numerous parties that have to be playing in, right? The homeowners need to be replacing wood chips around their property, making sure things aren't overgrown. Utility companies need to be inspecting their poles and transformers to field equipment, make sure there isn't a spark or collapse. And the insurance carriers, can't just be denying to write wildfire coverage in certain parts of the world. And then governments need to look at the legislative change. So I think you can kind of see a whole circle of, this is really the only way this operates, is if you get public and private equally involved. And the bottom line is having a plan.
I mean, this is the subject of this is obviously wildfires, but just in the last couple of minutes, I just want to broaden this out a little bit and kind of open the aperture, because like you say, Sydney, we're being faced with all these other sort of potentially catastrophic risks of rising sea levels, hurricanes, and huge floods. Do all of you or any of you think that this way of working, of looking at a community, coming up with community solutions, and then kind of taking that into the insurance markets and into the public sector space, does that offer an analog for us, do you think, in some of this other work, these other challenges that communities are facing? I don't know which any of you want to jump in there.
Absolutely, Tom. I mean, and the fact is, reliance on federal post-disaster relief or sovereign level relief after the fact is becoming unsustainable. And the U.S. is really helping to highlight that. A couple of years ago, the then acting administrator even said in a hearing that, the current level of spending is truly unsustainable. The number of declarations has gone up significantly, disaster declarations.
Of emergencies, right.
Yeah,
disaster.
yeah. And this is across all hazards, all natural hazards. There's a lot of impact that's happening in the US specifically, and also across the world, as we know. But reliance on federal post-disaster relief strategies and reliance on federal funding or sovereign level funding for risk reduction as the solution isn't working. What we need to do is really enable and empower communities and local leaders who understand their risk to make tough decisions, to implement these public policy solutions that materially impact their risk, and ultimately empower them to start to take on some of this challenge directly. And so, it's critical that federal incentives start to be built in that help communities look at financial resilient solutions, because it's great to have a sovereign or federal level government that's investing in helping a community invest, maybe with a cost share, right? Like in the US, with a 25% local cost share to reduce their physical risk. But that takes a long time to implement those public policy measures. And today, there's a tremendous lack of financial resilience. And so we think equally, and we recommend, in some of our findings here that, national level public policy be looked at, state level public policy be looked at for ways to help communities address the financial resilience challenges now. It's just really important that something happens. So I think this does represent a path by which communities, states, and federal level entities can address some of the challenges and changing risk that they're seeing. I think there is a pathway toward a solution there. And I think we will see reforms to better enable local and regional entities across many different nations look at this challenge and address their risks.
And Tom, I'd like
to
build on what Andy just said too, and come back to something I said earlier, which is this notion that if we protect nature, nature protects us. We're seeing all of these things happening. We have disasters. We're going to have sea level rise. We just saw flooding, in Tennessee this week that was catastrophic. And we know all that's going to continue with climate change. But when we protect the ecosystems around us, they offer us a number of benefits. They offer us climate mitigation benefits, actually helping us to fight climate change directly. They provide important, incredibly vital services for people, for animals, for wildlife, but they can protect us too. And so we've talked about this notion of fire buffers, but that's just one way that nature can help to provide this kind of protection. We can look at other systems, things like wetlands. If you take a healthy wetlands, it has flood risk benefits, for example, for an adjacent community. And so, as we think about this future that's characterized by climate change, we're going to have an increasing number of these kind of disasters. It's important to ask the question of how do we as humans really change the way that we're interacting with the natural systems around us and start to think about the way that we develop and plan our communities in a way that coexists with those systems so that they can offer us protective value.
Sydney Hedberg, any thoughts?
I agree on all fronts. Again, I think the work that they both have done on the CBCI front, I feel like it's just such common sense, right? But the bottom line is it takes a lot of investment and bringing these smaller communities to the table. You think about, I believe it was Greenville, Sydney, that was just decimated by the Dixie Fire recently, and just completely cleared this town out. So think about them. They're going to to be doing something very similar to what Paradise did a couple of years ago. It'll be a couple of years down the road when they're thinking about rebuilding, but how do they come back? I mean, they just don't want to give this town away. So again, it's just figuring out a way to coexist and not building back and basically setting themselves up for the exact same issue that happened again. And I think we have to get off of the government reliance on assistance, because again, you know, you might get some dollars, but it might take a really long time, and it's probably not going to be enough to make you whole. As Andy was talking about these assistance programs too, the FAIR plan in California for insurance was traditionally made to only house the most at-risk risks. It now is, I mean, I don't know what the capacity is, but it's way more than it was supposed to be. And so again, you're going to have this system of like, it's going to be teetering a little bit because it wasn't built to sustain, you know, a huge amount of the risk in California. And so, and again, maybe that risk is quantified and qualified as being very, very at risk, but we have to help change that in some way. And it's just, again, right. Mitigation and resilience is kind of the word, and it sounds like, oh, well, how do we start doing it? And it really starts with conversations, you know, take this to the state level, take this to the community level. Because again, I think if we just keep thinking, we'll do it next year and another big fire happens, big flood happens, we can't just kick the can.
Right. So I think that's excellent. That's a great way to finish. I think so. We've got a lot that's come out of this. We've got community-based solutions. We've got creative insurance solutions. We've got the need for creative public policy and planning, and the fact that this isn't just applicable to wildfires. Right. This is something that this is a process that can be applied to floods, to rising sea levels, and so forth. And it starts with the community, but it doesn't end with the community. And maybe one of the next BRINK events we should be doing is on rising sea levels or on some of this flooding issue, because it obviously affects thousands of livelihoods and businesses. But for the moment, we're on time. We're finished. Thank you very much indeed to Sydney Hedberg, Sydney Chamberlin, Andy Reid. Really appreciate your time. And that's it from us.
Thanks, Tom.